Bit of a it's a Rorschach test of like, okay, we're both looking at the same thing, but like, and yeah, we both see like you see a bunny and I see something else. I see a duck, and I think that's pretty unique. And I think yeah, to answer your question, it is true. One of the unique things I would say too is like your background and context matters a lot in some of this, and so does your incentive. And so that's another thing I would say is actually really important. Kind of jumping ahead to when you're an EIR is like you have to understand like why are folks making the decisions they are, and like what do they get if X outcome happens or Y does. And so yeah, it's definitely true. I think one of the challenges I would say though for a lot of those folks is if you were if you don't do your homework as an individual in that position to understand that the context of where people are coming from, you're going to question why people are making those things, making those decisions. And so you really have to be willing to do not just the surface level work, but go deep.
Welcome to EIR Live, where we dive into the lives and lessons of entrepreneurs in residence. I'm Ilya Tabakh, together with my co-host Terrance, ready to bring you closer to the heartbeat of the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Every episode, we explore the real stories behind the ideas, successes, setbacks, and everything in between. For everyone from aspiring EIRs to seasoned pros, EIR Live is your gateway to the depth of the entrepreneurial journey and bringing innovative insights into the broader world. Check out the full details in the episode description, subscribe to stay updated, and join us as we uncover what it takes to transform visions into ventures. Welcome aboard. Let's grow together. All right. And we are back for another amazing episode of EIR Live. What's exciting about today's episode is Victor Muchiri, who was actually EIR at Barton Malow, was one of the only other active EIRs that I could find in my long search when I was EIR at Black and Veatch over in the AEC space. I got really curious. I'm like, I can't be the only one, right? But then it wasn't so easy. Apparently, we've now identified that there may have been sort of programs and they kind of come and go. But it was really cool because Victor was actually the only person I could find that was an active EIR in AEC. And so I feel, sort of a connection, and we were sort of kindred spirits in some way. And so it's exciting for me personally to have Victor finally join us here on EIR Live. But, without kind of further ado, I'd love to jump in, Victor, and just talk about, where it all started and kind of get to know you a little bit as we dive into the episode.
Yeah, appreciate that, Ilya. Where did it all start? Well, first of all, I'm glad we got a chance to connect. Yeah, you're right. There's not that many EIRs in the construction or AEC space, so very thankful for that one. But my journey begins a long time ago in Kenya. So I was born originally in Nairobi, Kenya, which I think is pretty unique in that born there, grew up in South Africa in the late '90s, which is a tumultuous time to say the least to be Black in Cape Town, South Africa. That led to my family eventually immigrating to the U.S. So we won't go into all the details there, but let's again, Black family in South Africa. So that prompted the move. So that led us to moving to the U.S. in November of 1998. We actually moved to the U.S. or rather on Thanksgiving weekend. So pretty special time for me to remember Thanksgiving for that reason. Eventually, again, I grew up in Ohio in a small rural community, which I think again is a pretty unique dynamic. So growing up in a rural community while also maintaining my Kenyan roots in that community as well. That led me to eventually graduating high school, went to college at Ohio State, go Bucks, got my degree in construction management. But the interesting thing there is like, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I went to school thinking I wanted to become a doctor, one in biochem, changed my major about 5 different times, maybe 11, but who's counting? And then eventually ended up in construction management and graduated with that degree. And ever since then, I've been in and around the industry. So even on the career side, I think part of it is really less so about having a defined path and more so leaning into my curiosity. And that's kind of how I went from really interested in this, really interested in that. But eventually, right, you gotta put your foot down, make a decision and go forward. And that's kind of where I've been to date. So that's a little bit of context on the background, but yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
No, it is. And actually, before we jump too far, it's funny because it kind of mirrors I was born in Moscow and I moved to Kansas City when I was 7. Right. And so I moved from, like a pretty large global city to a less large, less global city. We'll put it that way. And, not to make fun of Kansas City. I love Kansas City, but, that experience and
showing up, especially with my whole family, right? Because we all immigrated together, and knowing that there's multiple perspectives, multiple sort of cultural lenses, and really getting curious about, for me, like, I'm like, what is this small place? And at the time, actually, Kansas City historically built their airport north of the river because they thought that was sort of where the city was going to grow. And then the city did not grow that way. And so when you flew into Kansas City, you're like flying into, there wasn't really much around at the time in 1990. And so I got really curious on like, how did this place work? And as you said, sort of leaning into that curiosity was actually a really good differentiator, because everybody else around me was like, well, this is how it always is. And, my family's from here and I know everything's usual, right? It's like, there's nothing uncommon. We'll pull on this thread later, but I just thought that kind of skill set and the ability to sort of look at the situation from a couple different perspectives, right? Because I sort of had one foot in each world, pretty early on. By the time I was 8 or 9, I was speaking and I was sort of doing all that stuff, but I could also kind of understand a different context. So I think it's important to sort of think about, what that enables. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that before we move on. All right. So you started kind of construction, didn't know what you wanted to do. That's like a pretty interesting foundation. Where does the story go from there?
Yeah, no pun intended on the foundation, but I think, I started my career doing this type of work and quickly realized, so my first job out of college, I was working on a stadium renovation at Ohio State. And they were adding a whole bunch of stuff, doing some stadium upgrades during the off season, classic stuff. And then I was like, well, this is good. But, at the time I was working for a company that was about $2-ish billion a year in top line revenue. And then I wanted to go work at Turner Construction, which for folks that don't know, Turner is the #1 general contractor. It's like, well, let me see what's happening over on that side of the team. So I did that. I went to Turner, and it is very, very different. At the time, Turner was doing about $15 billion, which is a material increase, right? From 2 or 3, depending on the calculations. And so, went through a couple different jobs there. Most notably, I went to work at a data center for a large hyperscaler. And it is, my God, I think at that point it was really cemented. It's like, I love this industry, but I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be that superintendent that's, up super early in the morning, that goes out and knows all the subs, knows all the procedures and workflows. Like, that just did not come natural to me. And so at that point, I was like, okay, I know I like this industry. I know I like numbers. I know I like some of the other stuff that makes a little bit more sense in my head. And so the question was like, how do I eventually parlay that into something else? So that led me to my next job at Turner still, which was an owner's rep job, which again, at that point, for those that don't know, you are representing a client. Turner is representing a client through a construction process. So my job was to help manage the owner's books and do some other stuff, represent them well in some of these meetings. Like, well, this is really interesting. So now I'm more client facing, dealing with the numbers, like, okay, we're getting closer and closer to what I want to do, but still not quite hitting the mark. And then at that point, a role opened up for Turner's headquarters position out of New York. I applied for it. My boss recommended me and was like, I think you do really well at this because it was not a construction role, but still within a construction company. I was like, all right, now we're starting to get closer and closer. And again, like even through all these experiences, I think part of it is like, where do I feel energy? Where do I feel energized? What am I leaning into? Where are my curiosities taking me? And I think, again, you got to be a little bit introspective to understand your strengths and weaknesses. And for me to be able to have an honest enough conversation with my manager at the time, who's a great guy, by the way, about like, hey, this is where I'm at right now. This is where I want to be. These are, obviously I work for you. Like, you see what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. And so having his support was really monumental for me to take on that next role. And so I did. It was supposed to be a 2-year rotational position. Did that for about 1 year. And then, at that point, you start planning your transition back to the business unit. But as I said, I'm not a construction guy at heart. Again, like for those who know superintendents and project managers, they're cut from a different cloth. And that just it didn't feel authentic. And so thankfully enough, I had a great relationship with my manager there. And I was talking through, it was like, okay, like what makes the most sense for you? Is it going back to the business? Is it leaving? Is it going into a different role, et cetera, et cetera? And so a position opened up at a startup. And at that point I was at an analyst level. And then at the startup, the opportunity was, so they were Series D startup, company was called Upstart. I was like, could I go into a startup and actually make it? Could I go prove it? They'd never hired someone in my role before. And so again, take a bet on myself. Do you really believe that you as a young analyst have the capacity and skills and wherewithal to go build this thing? I thought so, right? But maybe that's just young hubris. But we talked to my manager, and then eventually, yet again, I applied for the job and I got it. And then that takes us to COVID. So that's 2020. And my first day at this new job was the day everyone got sent home. So it's like, oh man, like I have no idea what's going to happen. Like turmoil is out in the streets, truly unknowns. And, again, like a lot of things happen from there on in the work world. But I think for me, it was, again, that this recurring theme of, I really know what I'm good at, or rather I'm learning, throughout my journey, throughout my career, of like what I'm getting good at. And am I willing continually to take a bet on myself? And Ilya, you made a comment earlier about coming from a different culture. I think part of that is the motivation behind that is like, okay, like I've got a shot here because it's something my parents did. And so again, there's like a little bit of fire in me because of that. And you see that in through some of the risks I'm willing to take versus some folks. And I think, again, throughout that progression of my time at Upstart, we built a product, we did all the right stuff, got everything built up. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we can pull on from after that and even through that experience. But I think that takes us to a pretty monumental pivoting point of COVID, whereby massive leap of faith into a completely new, different industry. Again, going from construction in the confines of a really large corporate company, you got safety net there, into a brand new startup. You have no idea during COVID, right? This is Fintech. So you have no idea what's actually going to happen. Is it going to pass? Is it going to fail? Eventually they IPO'd later that year, so everything was fine. But like, I didn't know that at the time. So it was a wild experience.
Well, and before we sort of take that monumental leap of faith, I just want to kind of double click on even the construction continuum. You just sort of mentioned the difference between a $2 billion and $15 billion, kind of organization and maybe how they think about the world. Construction is sort of, everybody says construction and is sort of this monolithic thing, right? But construction could be somebody stick building your fence, to somebody building your strip mall or multifamily kind of unit in your neighborhood, to somebody building a refinery, right? Which is ultimately like an industrial, very complicated, process-oriented type facility, or a power facility. And then, as you said, kind of representing the owner or a contractor. Different parties hold risk. So it's, in some ways it's pretty cool that by education and then by your first few professional touch points, you got some pretty good insights from kind of different levels in that stack too.
I think I want to double down on this, Ilya, and I want to use the word adaptability when I double down on this, because there's something unique. I'm American, right? You guys immigrated to the United States, and there's something about the immigrant story and being adaptable in different situations. And I think that lends itself well to, becoming an entrepreneur, trying different things, like running towards things that you don't really know what's on the other side, but you notice one thing: you only get one shot to get it right. And I think it's something about that lights a fire under most of my friends. I'm the only American in my friend group, right? And that we have this fire, right, to where you want to do something new. And I think that adaptability is showing itself in Victor's story, right? But not only that, Victor graduated from Ohio State in Ohio. He moved to New York for this rotation thing that happened, from what I understand. And then he went back to Ohio, okay? And then he made the big leap of faith, which we'll get into in a second, in Indiana. Walk us through that, Victor.
Yeah, I mean, I think the leap of faith is real because, again, like my college degree is in X, and then I went to go do Y. Like that's hard. That's hard. And not only that, quite frankly, like I took a massive pay cut to go do that. Like I truly was taking a bet to whereby if this did not work out, what am I going to do next? Because at this point, a couple of years had passed. Like, was I going to go back basically to be, multiple years junior to my peers? It's like, in the fullness of time, like nothing really matters. But anyway, so at that point, yeah, one caveat I would say is like I was working remote out of New York. So I was traveling to and from New York quite a bit, which was remote. And that was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to go work at Upstart, because it had a local office and I want to go work in person. And then again, COVID happened. So that that didn't happen. But yeah, I mean, I think that was fundamental. And then you mentioned High Alpha in Indy. One of the reasons I really like that firm is fundamentally what they were doing on the innovation side was exploring how can you create advantage startups on behalf of corporates and universities, right? And so that to me really screamed, okay, if I want to learn more about entrepreneurship, if I want to learn more about venture and innovation, true innovation in this capacity, this is probably one of the best firms to do it. So I interestingly enough, I actually pitched High Alpha Capital, a startup idea that I had. And then, through multiple conversations, ended up at High Alpha Innovation. I was like, well, why not just come work here instead? And so that's kind of how that relationship happened. But funnily enough, it was a construction tech idea, right? Again, love the industry, but again, still not a superintendent. One thing led to another, ended up going to High Alpha Inno. the funny thing there is when I got on that job, the first project I helped support was a company called Plot, which is actually a construction tech company. So that was great. And then the next project I worked on was actually UNC healthcare. So that was a pretty unique shift too. It was like, again, like mentally, you think about the curiosity where I said earlier, I want to go to school to become a doctor. Obviously that didn't happen, but there's still this curiosity in the back of my head as related to this stuff. And so as I'm working on these projects, somehow, some way, these things keep coming back, and it's always full circle as to you're interested in this, not doing it full time, but still comes up and flares up. So that's a pretty unique experience. But again, I think the big thing there is like, okay, you leave construction to go do this. You work at a startup. You work at a startup to go learn more about innovation. You learn more about innovation to go apply that in somewhere else. And I think that's, again, the evolution of these themes is really what you mentioned adaptability, but I think the evolution and being adaptable to the scenarios about like, what am I learning here? What are the skills? And I think about it as a Lego set. Like you have different pieces that you need to learn and assemble, and then eventually you get to the end result.
I think that's fascinating because the first venture that I ever built as an EIR was in construction, and we were talking to PMs and superintendents and tool room managers as well, and that's who we actually end up building the venture for. So actually, for tool room managers, and as you know, Victor and Ilya, on every construction site there's a gang box, and those game boxes have tools in it that you need to complete a job, essentially. And we came up with the idea of what if a game box could talk, right? And what if people could track their tools throughout construction site and beyond, if you will. And it goes a little bit beyond that, but it's kind of weird that the first thing I've ever done as an EIR was build a venture in construction. And now it's sort of full circle. I'm interviewing you on the podcast along with Ilya, and you're the only EIR that he could find in the industry at that time. So very interesting. And then you went to High Alpha, right? Focused on, venture creation, new venture creation for corporations. That's a direct sort of, I would say a partner or a competitor to where I was at as a firm, as a partner at Mach 49, essentially. Also trying to create new ventures for corporations. Let me double down on the connectivity here. I also sit on the board of UNCF Digital Health Initiative, right? Which was the health thing that you worked on, which eventually turned into Goldie, which is a company called Goldie today, So I don't know if that's the same company or a different one, but I think there's a lot of connectivity between what you've done at High Alpha, the healthcare thing you started to work on, which was the first company that ever failed for me before I became an EIR. So there's a lot of interesting connectivity here, but you went back to Upstart. You went back to the startup. Tell us why.
It was a fascinating time in the financial markets. 2021 was, and 2022. And by fascinating, I mean literally unprecedented. Like we've never seen this kind of thing happen in a very long time. And so again, it was a bit of a cheat code having been in the startup at first and having seen things happen. Again, I went through the IPO process, and that was December of 2020. And then at that point, you can kind of see a couple things happening in the market. So why did I go back? I think number one, fintech then, and even still to this day, is an extremely, in my opinion, underappreciated aspect of the innovation world. There's a lot of interesting technologies there that I think the general masses don't necessarily appreciate. And so for me, it was going back to what is it that I could learn? What is it that I could provide value back to the company to? But both of those are important. It's not just a one-way street. And so I would say the curiosity of that. And so my role at Upstart at the time was, project manager, but really focusing in strategy and operations for automotive lending. So what I did was for folks that don't know, Upstart is a triple-sided marketplace. So you have consumers on one end that, apply for and get the loans. You have lenders, so credit unions, banks, and financial institutions that originate the loans, the capital. And then through the back end, you have capital markets buyers, think about hedge funds, institutional buyers, et cetera, that actually purchase the loan pools. My job within the organization, within Upstart, was to sit at the middle and understand what's happening to the product and then the business implication of that. Meaning, if we make marketing changes to a sign-up flow and that affects our conversion rate, what does that mean to the loan performance of that portfolio for different risk rates? So little things like that. And so, okay, you keep mentioning adaptability, and I think this is a good example of that. It's like, okay, there's a consumer side that you have to get really curious about to understand how do different product changes affect the consumer. There's a lending side of like, how do banks think about risk and what does that actually translate to origination volume and or like the actual prices that consumers see when they get a loan. And then lastly, explaining all these things to a large hedge fund or capital markets buyer is a fascinating place. And you have to be able to, even though one transaction is happening, you have multiple parties that see things very differently, and you have to be adaptable to actually contour the message to each of those and make sure that it fits the narrative of what makes sense. And again, I think that's largely you asked why did I go back? I think the curiosity aspect. And then two, when you think about that role, it is so dynamic. And again, against a backdrop of interest rates were near free. And then each quarter they kept escalating. And so, okay, this is a hard job. This is really, really challenging. But if you're a curious person, you're willing to put in the hours of the time, I think that's actually a really unique place for you to go. And again, I think when you think about taking a bet on myself, is like, I did not come up through the finance world, right? I never worked in investment banking. I didn't do any of that stuff. And then you go talk to a bank of folks that have been grinding at this for years or decades. I think it was a good test of what am I actually capable of? There's a lot of really smart folks at these really top startups. And for me, I went to Ohio State, and not to poo-poo on Ohio State, but it's not the same as, an Ivy League. And so I think it was a good test of like, what am I capable of mentally? Do I have that horsepower to go execute against this? And, I would say, it was a fairly successful outcome. I would give myself a B+ in that role. I think there's things to be learned, but you got to be honest with yourself. And I think that the big reason why it was exciting, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, is the curiosity aspect. You learn so much because it's just so dynamic, and against a backdrop of time, like time compression is real in a startup. You have to move fast because everything else is just so much faster around you, and everyone else is too.
Just to actually jump into that, I've been lucky a few times in my professional career to sort of sit at the interface of different disciplines and see how they're looking at the same information with a different sort of background and a different set of tools and interpreting the world in a completely different way. And I can only imagine that in the role that you just described over at Upstart, that you were sitting at, sort of the fissure between 2 or 3 or 4 different disciplines, right? And even thinking about how do people make sense of things, kind of what's their due diligence, how do they do sort of their homework, how does sort of Upstart understand consumer behavior? That's a whole, probably book, if not series of episodes. So we won't dive too much into that. But I think for me, being at the table when 2 super sophisticated folks, but from very different backgrounds and perspectives, look at the world, look at the same set of information and make completely different conclusions was like a really good formative moment. I'm curious on, does that ring true, A, and 2, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it does ring true. It's a bit of a Rorschach test of like, okay, we're both looking at the same thing, but like, and yeah, we both see, like, you see a bunny and I see something else. I see a duck. And I think that's pretty unique. And I think, yeah, to answer your question, it is true. One of the unique things I would say too is like your background and context matters a lot in some of this, and so does your incentive. And so that's another thing I would say is actually really important, kind of jumping ahead to when you're an EIR, is like, you have to understand like why are folks making the decisions they are, and like, what do they get if X outcome happens or Y does? And so, yeah, it's definitely true. I think one of the challenges I would say though, for a lot of those folks is if you don't do your homework as an individual in that position to understand that the context of where people are coming from, you're going to question why people are making those things, making those decisions. And so you really have to be willing to do not just the surface level work, but go deep, understand the context, understand the background. What do they get? What do they not get? Et cetera, et cetera. But yes, to answer your question directly, 100%.
Yeah. And just that, that's a theme. That's when people ask what's a superpower that an EIR can bring to a residence, right? Many entrepreneurs that I know and folks that, ultimately roll into EIR roles, don't think that that's a special thing, right? The fact that they have operating experience, that they have sort of muscle memory to see when, once they really understand and can quantify and parameterize incentives and actions, they start to see, how the world, be able to tell the future a little bit. And that skill set is like super underappreciated in, kind of organizations that don't necessarily have that kind of skill set or background. So, just wanted to kind of specifically call that out because there's so many things that you can bring to the table from, sort of this diverse operational skill set that's useful in a place where that skill set may not be plentiful. And I think, we just talked through one of my favorites is, sort of empathetic design, and then the ability to sort of parameterize and understand, disparate and different types of actors in an ecosystem.
Yeah.
So,
And I think
yeah.
that actually applies really well to the construction industry, right? Like that's a lot of the context that I'm bringing to the table. It's like this is an industry that's, fairly large. These are large companies, right? And they're filled with really smart people. But the context of how they're trained and the way that they problem solve is very different than other industries. And so if you can bring some of those lessons from outside in, it's actually really, really powerful. Now, of course, you'll get some pushback because we've done this for the last 100 years. Like, what are you talking about? I think that's true to some degree, but being empathetic to say like I've seen this work before, this is why it worked, like how does that translate into this world? I think that's what the superpower is, less so about this worked over here and let's just rip and replace it. And that's not the winning formula.
No, 100%. And you mentioned the word translation, which we use a lot on this podcast, on having EIRs become translators. You decided to translate all of your experience, Victor, from construction. Then you went to fintech in the startup world. But you made another transition, that most people want to make in this world of startups, once you've done pretty well for yourself. And the job of this person that you became in the role that you got next was to sort of look into the future just a little bit and work backwards to figure out what startups you should fund. And this time you did it in the world of insurance. The quote that I heard when I first got my job in venture capital was, it's easier to become a professional basketball player or any athletic sport than it is to become a venture capitalist. Okay. And you were able to do it with a transition, despite not having a finance background, despite not having an MBA, despite not going to the Ivy League. Tell us about the transition, my friend, to becoming a VC.
Yeah. It's hard. It's a different world. Like it's just a different world. I think part of it is a different culture, different subculture, different sub languages. I think it's just a different way of operating in the world. I think, quite frankly, for me, coming out of Upstart into that role, it was really focused on understanding deeply about financial services as part one. Like you have to be able to understand like that world, and particularly on the insurtech side. So I worked at Nationwide Insurance. It had a CVC. And so half the business is insurance, half the business is financial services. And so being able to talk the language, even if you are within an organization that you can talk to some of those folks, that's part one. I think part two, as far as the VC goes, part of your job as a VC is to see the future, quote unquote. Like you have to be able to see the dots and then be able to connect them in a way that other people don't. And hopefully you get there first, right? Like not only do you have to be right, but you have to be early. So that's part one. And then the second thing too is like, when you work at a startup, you kind of see what works and what doesn't work. Now, again, like I didn't work from the startup from day zero to fruition, but I think you still get a glimpse of from private to public. And that's a pretty unique aspect that, quite frankly, a lot of folks don't get to see. I think that combination was pretty unique for a lot of folks, again, despite the not having. But I think the other thing too is a deep, deep curiosity. Like I cannot overstate how curious you have to be in order to learn, because a lot of this stuff, like they don't teach you. There's not a lot of textbooks out there that teach you how to become a good VC. Like people write about it, but it's not the same. And so you have to be curious to go talk to folks. You have to be curious to go do the homework. And so in order to get these jobs, you have to go do a case study. It's like, okay, well, go find me a company and write up a memo on this before. And I'd never done this world before. I didn't come from investment banking. And so you got to do a lot of research. And again, there's like nights and weekends. Like this is stuff that, there's a quote out there, like you should find work that feels like fun. And for me, that felt like fun. And so when I can find myself doing these things after hours and I enjoy them and it doesn't feel like a strain, and I'm writing about these things and doing the memos and all that stuff, like that to me was a pretty good exercise that showed like, hey, maybe there's something there, right? And so doing that and then demonstrating that to the team at Nationwide to say, hey, like this is what I'm capable of. I know I don't have XYZ on my pedigree, but this is what I can still do without that. So imagine me like under the tutelage, under whatever it may be. And then like that's kind of how I parlayed, certain experiences in my career into that role.
And just by the way, that it's amazing how successful you can be when you're focusing on how you can sort of help whoever you're working with win, right? You just sort of took one of my favorite short plays out of the playbook. Is a lot of folks are able to talk about the things that they're good at, but a lot of folks are not able to contextualize the things that are strengths for theirs, how it can help sort of whoever they're working with win. And so that's kind of what I heard you talking about a little bit. It's not just what are your capabilities, but sort of that awareness of what does winning for that organization even look like? And then, what role do you play in that game is really an important and often, unfortunately, overlooked thing to do. So kudos on that, because a lot of folks, sort of say, hey, I'm good at really this and I'm good at that, but they don't think about what does winning for everybody look like, and then how can I sort of translate the capabilities that I have to be able to actually contribute.
One thing I'll say there is like a sports analogy, right? It's like you play a certain position, maybe you can flex into one or two others, but like sometimes a team doesn't need 5 centers. They need 2 centers. Like maybe you're just a really good shooting guard. Okay, well, go be a good shooting guard somewhere else that needs a shooting guard. Like that's what you need to do. Go find out.
Absolutely. I want to sort of clarify something for the audience, because you use the word CVC, VC. Oftentimes I get notes on LinkedIn about, hey, I've learned a ton from the podcast. Can you guys define some of these words for us? So Victor, can you tell people the difference very quickly between a CVC and a VC?
Yeah. So traditional venture capital and CVC, corporate venture capital, are a little bit different. Like they play a similar sport, but they're a little bit different. Traditional VC will have a limited number of limited partners or investors that put money into the fund. And then those investors then go deploy that capital. It's usually pretty financially driven. At a CVC, you have a blend. You have a dual mandate of financial returns, but also strategic to the core organization or corporation. So if you were to invest on behalf of the organization, you're targeting things that could be a strategic add-on to the business through any number of ways, in addition to trying to get a good financial return on that capital. So that's the difference between a CVC's dual mandate versus single mandate.
And that actual sort of dual versus single, especially for startups, can be super confusing, because in many cases, the startup wants to have a successful financial outcome, and then has to be really careful about thinking on who's on their cap table, what are their motivations, because ultimately, I think we'll call it the cardinal sin, for lack of a better term, of a startup is misalignment between an investor and the entrepreneur. And it's pretty easy when there's sort of different motivations in your capital, cap table. And so, we won't dive too much into that, but it's that, especially in like construction tech and sort of energy transition startups, there's a lot of strategic investors, a lot of really good strategic investors, but there's all kinds of choices being made all the time about, hey, do we take a strategic investor from a large concrete company? Because then we'll be seen as sort of one of their commercial partners, and they may have sort of some input into our commercial go-to-market. And so it's like an important and careful thing to consider. Anyway, that's an aside, probably for a different podcast, but we got into it, so here we are.
Yeah. I will say like that does come into play, particularly as an EIR, right? If you're thinking about, different companies, different firms call EIR different things, and there's different mandates there. But if you are thinking about spinning out a company, a product or whatever, like who is providing the financial backing for that provides a lot of context as to how you need to think about doing so. So yeah, should you take on strategic capital versus traditional versus, go to a bank and get debt? I don't know. It depends on the startup, but like that's a huge filter that a lot of people don't necessarily spend enough time thinking about.
100%. And you brought it up just now, so you've teed it up nicely for me. And so walk our audience through how you landed your first entrepreneur in residence gig. Where was it at? What did you do?
Yeah.
Let's walk us through your day to day.
So you've heard me say time and time again, construction is my background. It is something very near and dear to my heart. I don't know why, but it truly does feel like a calling to me. I think part of it is, it's pretty cliche in the industry, but there's a lot of folks that will say, there's something about driving by a building and you get to see things progress, that's real. And then over time, you get to look at the skyline of a city as like, oh, I worked on that job. So for me, being able to go back into the real world, quote unquote, was something that I really desired. And so I had spent, some time after college working at a company called Barton Malow. So I interned there during school, worked there through my senior year, and worked there as a project engineer right out of school. So I knew some of the folks there, thankfully had done, decent enough work at the beginning to make those good relationships. And so in wanting to get back into the real world, quote unquote, I reached out to the fine folks over at Barton Malow and said, hey, like I would love to come back, but realistically, like I would want it to be in a more entrepreneurial capacity. Like this is what I want to do. Again, going back to the memo, for some reason, memos are my thing. And so I wrote out like, this is kind of what I'm thinking about. This is how I would add value. This is where I think I could slot into some of this stuff. And again, some of that is doing homework on my own of like tracking them over time and seeing, okay, seems like they're making a lot of investments in this area. How can I fit into that? And again, you tailored the memo and the outreach to that. Over a period of a few months, meeting with various folks, different executives, different directors within the organization, and kind of going through the conversations to really firm up like, hey, there's something really here. I think that's what really led me to my EIR role. I think it was me recognizing I love the construction industry. I really do. But I think the avenue of which, or the role that I play here, has to be a little bit different. And sometimes, quite frankly, you have to make that up. Like, you have to make up a new role. Like, the EIR role was not a job I applied to. And quite frankly, usually they're not. Like, you kind of have to be crafted. And so again, I think being really honest with yourself and saying, this is where, not only to Ilya's point, like, this is what I'm good at, but like, this is where I can add value back to you. I think that level of transparency and kind of being straight up with folks, that's how you get from point A to point B. I think if you were to come in and say like, oh, I can do X, Y, Z, I can do it all. Like, I don't know that people really resonate with that as much anymore. I think you really got to be able to say, I've done X in my career to date. I have this foundational background. This is where I could slot in. I think that resonated, quite frankly, a little bit more than the opposite approach.
I really like this, and I want to double down for our audience of what you said. EIR roles, you really can't apply for them. It's very few. I can count on one hand how many EIR roles I see on a quarterly basis, right? They are really created, and it's usually when somebody's going to raise their hand to have the role created, or to go to bat for something that should be entrepreneurial inside of an organization. And almost every EIR role that I see people in, it was created for the most part. So for all the folks who reach out to me on LinkedIn talking about how do you land your first EIR gig, like, where do I find them? You don't. They find you. Right. They find you, or you go pitch the opportunity to become an EIR potentially, like our good friend Victor did, or like others on our show have done. Like Dan and others have pitched their first EIR role. It was not in the organization. Frankly, a lot of these orgs don't even know what that is, and they're not even thinking about it. You need somebody entrepreneurial like a Victor who has had life experience in a startup, in a big company, as a VC, that came back and was like, hey, I've seen these things, and I believe I can bring that to bear to help you and to add value here. You know, I think that is a very big point. I just don't want that to get lost in what you just said, Victor.
Yeah, the thing maybe I'll add there is there's definitely a lot of universities and places that will say, hey, we need an EIR program. But a lot of the time when there is sort of either a ceremonial role or something that you can apply for, there's not normally sort of the skill set or background at the table to be like really intentional about how do you pair somebody that's got sort of the right archetype to be an EIR with sort of a successful outcome for the residents. And so I think, you know, and we've talked about this for many episodes, it comes up all the time. It's sort of in order to really be an effective entrepreneur in residence, it's kind of, what's your secret sauce? Can you communicate it? Has the residents actually done their sort of homework, and are they really intentional, and have they aligned their strategy and all that stuff? And obviously nobody's perfect, right? It's hard to sort of do that once and then move on. But if they have, it's normally a better outcome. And then sort of that third reskilling piece, right? That most entrepreneurial personalities are not necessarily good spiritual leaders, and then sort of organizational influencers. And the whole point is not for you to, you know, single-handedly bail water with a bucket, but teach people about fluid mechanics, right? So it's that's a weird analogy, but we're going with it. And so, you know, that spiritual leader role is pretty important as well. But yeah, anyway, I agree with Terrance though, generally.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say too, Ilya, you mentioned, is like the skill set that I think a lot of good EIRs are required to have. It's not like a resume of like, check the box, you go do this. I think the skill set is actually pretty unique, but that actually sometimes is counter to what makes a traditional good employee at some of these companies. And there's a bit of a leap of faith yet again of like, okay, which path do I really want to go down towards? Is it going to be a really good corporate employee? You know, you stay here for X amount of years, you kind of know what happens between today and the day you retire. Or am I willing to really lean into these strengths that I have and then jump into the deep end, quote unquote, and try it out?
Yeah, and let's pull on that a little bit more. I mean, to me, when my kind of EIR role, I saw my job was to sort of be at the interface of the outside world and the organization, right? And even like, how do you structure it? Do you become an employee or you're a contractor, that kind of thing? I spent a little bit of time kind of thinking about those two things. But I essentially, like in my own head, wrote my, you know, kind of mental resignation letter. And I'm like, if I'm not, you know, being provocative and sort of telling them how it is from my perspective, then I'm really not doing my job. And I got to say, once you're dead, you're not afraid of anything, right? And it's like, it's an amazing superpower, right? if you're a dead man walking, right, there's nothing that can slow you down. And it's I think maybe an extension of what you were saying, but I think that's a way that you can kind of mobilize that perspective, and also maybe explain that, hey, I'm coming at this from this perspective, but let me walk back and say, here's, sort of other places in the world that this is successful, and let's try to help connect the dots for you. And then also, it's okay to tell somebody they're wrong. They don't hear that very often in larger organizations, because that's just not how the organization normally is designed. And so, yeah, anyway, it's just like, it rhymes with my experience as well.
Yeah, a couple of things there I want to touch on. I think the last piece is really, really relevant for the construction industry or the built world, right? Particularly in the AEC space, because yes, like quote unquote, we have a lot of innovation teams, we have a lot of disruption happening. But like, this is a bit of an antiquated industry. Like, I think a lot of people see that. It's not to say it's a laggard. It's not. There's a lot of really smart things happening and really cool things happening. But the idea that, we've been successful today doing X, Y, Z, I think we really as an industry have to refocus that and like try to say, if we've been this successful, what else could we do? And start framing it as a more positive effect as opposed to a negative. And I think that's part of the job. I actually would advocate for more folks, more organizations to have EIRs, regardless of the firm. But I think you should just do it. I think the idea of like challenging the status quo should be an industry norm that we really should be having across the board. I think to your point, the job is to understand what is the current landscape, how can we challenge that, and where can we grow? That's what should be happening. And I'm a huge proponent of that.
No, let's double down on this a little bit, Victor, because you keep teeing me up nicely. And hey, what advice would you give leaders, right? You're advising the CEO or the board of a company who's thinking about bringing or starting an EIR program or bringing on their first EIR. What advice would you give them to make sure that that person feels welcome in that residence and that they're ready for somebody like a Victor to come in to actually show them the way to build out new capabilities?
I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think number one is like, culturally, like what kind of culture do you have in the organization? Are you one that embraces change or is pretty resistant? I think that's part one. Part two is going to be, even if you do set up this organization or this function and you hire in the right person, will they have the right resources to actually go execute their job? That's another thing you have to really commit to. And then the third thing is like, okay, against what time frame? Are you thinking 3 months, 6 months, 3 years? Like what are you actually going to do? I think those are really three key questions I would advise on. Is like, you need to get pretty crystal clear as to what are you going to do? Are you going to support them? If so, what does that look like? But then even beyond that, I would also say there's so much that needs to happen behind the scenes, like organization alignment between other executives. If someone does come up with this and they have the CEO's backing, will the business still shut it down? Will they starve it of resources, or will they actually be a proponent of it? When you go to market, what happens there? Can you actually co-brand something? Are you going to say on behalf of X? Are you creating a new product or your own? Like, where do you actually get the support from the organization if it does exist? Like, there's so much that happens behind the scenes beyond just, hey, I think you should do this. Because then the other thing is, okay, AI is the new hot buzz, right? Has been. It's not really new, but has been for a little bit. And then the question to the organization is, what are we doing with AI? Are we, fighting an existential crisis here? Like, what's our future look like? I think this is actually a really good opportunity for someone dedicated to looking at other things outside of the core business to question some of those things. So if you bring in, an EIR or some other function of someone that's really dedicated to doing this is actually the best time to do it. Okay, if you have, again, I come from the construction industry, but if I say we've been doing estimating or scheduling or pre-construction or any of these, pre-construction services, what does that look like in the future in this new paradigm? To me, that's hard for the core business to answer because they've been doing this for XYZ years and they've gone to this current steady state. But hiring an EIR, bringing them on board to question this, and then if the answer is like, we should change, what does that change look like? Is that a new product? Is that a new service? Is that a new company? And then we go back to where we began. It's like, okay, should we spin it out? Do they have the company resources that they're behind, et cetera, et cetera? So I would say, like, if I'm advising a new CEO, like writ large, I wouldn't just say, do it, just simply because, that's a cliche answer. But yeah, do it. Like, I think you should spend some time thinking about what that actually looks like if you were to do it. Because I don't think you should do it unless you're willing to back up the truck and actually give resources. I don't just mean financial. I mean, like, the company resources behind that position.
I really like your answer on this, Victor. And I want you to double down on the sentence because you just hit the three main things that I hear often about this. And you started to touch on that last thing that really puts the nail in the coffin, which is the alignment of incentives for the EIR to do the work that they're used to doing. Usually those people are motivated by equity or, growing the company to the largest outcome that they can get it to, right? But usually when you're inside the walls of a bigger organization, you can't make more money than the CEO is what they will say, right? So you have to be open if you're going to bring into somebody entrepreneurial, that if they build a thing, they can build it as big as they possibly can. You need to incentivize them to do so. And that's not going to just be a base salary.
Yeah. I could not agree more. But that's hard. That's sticky. It takes a lot of confidence as an executive to say like, yes, this is the right thing for the organization, even if that person makes more money than me. And you see it all the time with sales folks where like, the sales guys are crushing it. Let's increase our quota. The sales guys are crushing it again. Let's increase. Like it's counterintuitive. If you're bringing in business, you're bringing in revenue, you're revolutionizing the business. It's value add to everyone in the organization. That's where I mean, like at the beginning, you have to have the right culture in order to facilitate that. And so, yeah, I think incentives do matter. And this is kind of I don't know, it was a dirty secret. Like, this is why you see a lot of folks at CVCs, going back to the VC example, like it doesn't always pan out because in a traditional venture, you get carry, right? So what is carry? Investors give you money, you return the money. And then if you return more than what they gave you, you get a percent of that. But if you go to a CVC, you don't get the same benefits. You don't have the same incentives. And so then, okay, like, I don't know. All that to say, similar thing happens in an EIR role. Okay, like, yes, we all have a base salary. We need to pay the bills. But what's on top of that? What is my motivation? Is it I'm just that passionate? Is it goodwill? Am I like looking for a financial outcome here? Am I going to be a partner someday? Like, what is that? And I think folks need to get pretty crystal clear as to what they're offering to a potential EIR and vice versa. What is an EIR walking into? Like, they need to both have alignment and agreement as to what that agreement is before one side could really feel confident, in my opinion, moving forward.
And the flip side of that, just to jump in real quickly, is as an operator outside of a parent, you also have a lot more degrees of freedom. And we're way closer to the true north of market traction and sort of sitting next to your client and customer and things like that. And so in many organizations, it's very tough to cannibalize, in many cases, still successful businesses to build the next generation of something, right? Because in many cases, you're eating into your margin in order to get higher volume. You know, you're sort of reconfiguring things that most of the organization has stood. And so it's not just alignment of incentives, but it's alignment of incentives at multiple levels, right? Because you may be acting against the personal incentives of a part of the organization for the betterment of the bigger organization, right? And then from the EIR side, if you haven't been in residence before, there's a lot of like organizational management stuff that most operators are just not trained on. That's just not their background, right? And so, you know, and I guess the third piece to this is there's a lot of things that are culturally there because it's a different risk environment, right? So in construction, and especially in the physical world, like you have to manage safety risk and things like that because, you know, people have to go back to their families. And so I've said this before in other discussions, but, you know, moving fast and breaking things when there's I-beams flying around is not acceptable. It's just not, you know, like your decision and lack of control for risk should not end up, you know, killing somebody. And so there is some of these things that are the way that they are for a reason, and sort of making sense of that and being eyes wide open is part of the challenge and the opportunity. But, you know, I didn't want it to sort of make it a one-sided bashing of, listen, residents, everything is broken. And, you know, it's more complicated. And I'm not saying that's what you guys were saying, but like, that's where I think the real magic has. It's translation, but it's got to be in sort of the appropriate organizational and cultural context, because some things are the way that they are for a reason. All right, didn't mean to stop the thing, but it's just like it's pretty easy to sort of poke at the bear, but every once in a while the bear is big and the bear is strong for a reason, right? Yeah. So,
it's true. Yeah. I think that's fair. It's like, yeah, it's classic innovation dilemma. Like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna, you know, you're gonna reinvent yourself as a new organization. But like, again, like they've been successful, and not just like Barton Malow, but like any company that has an EIR, they've been successful to date in order to even facilitate that sort of position. And so there's a little bit of a push and pull. I think you nailed it on the head about like a lot of the early work has to be change management. Like, you have to manage expectations, you have to manage relationships, you have to get alignment, because if you don't, like, what are you going to do when you get a flashy new toy? Like, no one in the business is going to adopt it. You're going to have a hard time selling it. Like that is part of the job too. And you mentioned a lot of quote unquote innovators or founders or EIRs coming out from the startup world. It's like, no, we'll just, you know, move fast. We'll break things. We'll create. Like the business is the technology. Like, it's actually sometimes the opposite. You got to fit the other way around in order to make it work, and that requires the backing of the company. by doing some of the softer things like getting consensus, getting alignment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. One sort of surprising example, actually, now that we're talking about it, comes to mind that I see is that technology innovators come from a technology culture, right? They're used to sort of deploying new things and using maybe science, maybe process, whatever, to do things differently. Operators are all about performance and, managing risk. And so there's like actually a very large culture clash on, hey, I have this new thing. It's shiny. Shiny means scary, right? So like when you in climate tech and energy transition, you have this sort of concept of first of a kind, right? When you say first of a kind to a financier, that just like all the risk alarms go off, right? The insurance folks are like, how many hours of operations? 10,000 hours. We need at least 50,000 hours, right? And then the financing folks are like, first of a kind. We like to do like fourth of a kind, right? And here's why. Here's like sort of and so it's just like one word that is exciting and motivating to one group is scary and like red flag to the other group. And so, I've seen that kind of play out in that context, which I think is kind of applicable here, actually, that you're brave and strong could mean scary and dangerous to another group of people that are really important for you to sort of work with.
There's that translation. That's the job. You got to be able to do that. You got to be able to talk both languages. You got to sit in the middle and be able to translate. Like fundamentally, like the guy that created the wheel. Like, you know what I mean? Like going back to any time period, the guy that created the wheel, like that's scary for folks. Like, well, no, we've already got a process in place. This guy has a job. He does this. Like that's
we got
scary.
sleds.
I know. Yeah. Like pick any example, like that is part of the job. Like that is innovation at its core.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to dig in a little bit. So you went from kind of the EIR role to a strategy role, and we were kind of talking a little bit before we kicked off the recording here on how kind of having the EIR role gives you maybe a little bit of a different perspective and sort of other functions of the organization. So would love to have you dig into that for a little while.
Yeah, strategy is it's interesting. Going back to the EIR role is like, okay, if your mandate is to go figure out where we can create additional value for a corporation through the invention or innovation of new products, services, or companies, that's a pretty cool mandate. So when you think about the translation to strategy, it's similar, but different. It's similar in that you're still thinking about the long-term horizon of an organization or a function, depending on your strategy role. But then the question is like, can you make it more grounded? Can you make it more applicable to the organization? So for me, in my role, I was really focused on operation strategy. So supporting the business, like not just the enterprise, thinking about, here are the goals for the next 3 to 5 years, but like what makes sense for the organization, for business, for people that grew up in the industry, in the business, to go execute on that. So that could be any number of priorities, right? Like I won't share too much there, but I think can you be embedded in the business to understand the long-term trends, the long-term opportunities, and how do you steer a massive behemoth of a ship into that direction? I'm only one person, only one man, but I think the job of a strategist is to see what's going to be coming down the pipeline and hopefully make sense of heads or tails in order to steer the boat in that direction. And I would say one of the challenging aspects of that, there's a couple, but one of them that I think really does play into the EIR role specifically is that if my job was to see what was possible, what is capable of happening, translating that back into the organization now in a different capacity is actually really unique. Because I mentioned earlier, part of the job of being an EIR within a corporation is to do the consensus building, do the relationship building. And so now in the strategy role, a lot of those foundations are already there. You already have, relationships with folks that are running business units, that are directors, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you go talk to them about like, hey, I think, I'm looking at doing a competitive analysis of XYZ company. This is what the industry is doing. Where are we positioned within that? What does the future look like? And how do we chart the path between here and there? It's easier for you to have that dialogue with them because you've already done the front work up front, is to prove yourself that one, you're capable, two, you're actually bringing them along for the journey and not dictating because you said in some office or something. But it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to do that work because the time horizons may be a little bit different between the EIR, but I think functionally they're actually similar in the fact that you have to be aware of what's happening today. You need to be able to see what's happening in the future. And then I think specifically for the strategy role is like more so internally, how do we do that together as a team? Less so how do I do that on an island just in benefit of the organization?
Incredible. And Victor, I want to make sure we get you out of here on time, man. I know we're approaching up to clock, but I want to know that beyond the EIR role, what can you share with our audience on what are you doing outside of work? Like what are the things that Victor is working on that you're passionate about outside of work?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. One, I enjoy walking. It sounds silly, but I enjoy walking. I enjoy putting on my headphones and kind of vibing out to some EDM. I think that's fun. I play some soccer every once in a while to stay active a little bit. I enjoy being outdoors. That's all on the fun stuff. I also help run an orphanage in Kenya. I mentioned earlier in the call that I'm originally from there, so I help run an orphanage there. We have the number grows all the time, but somewhere around 45 kids in our care. We're actually in the process of trying to build a school for them so we could have a private school for folks that are in our care as well as a community to come and join and get a pretty good education. It's a rural Kenya, so we're doing a lot of good work. And the stories these kids have are really challenging, to say the least. And so I think we're doing some pretty good work there that adds a lot of value to me. And then personally, like long-term career-wise, I think going back to the EIR role, like I eventually want to start something. Like that's just the reality. And I think having seen and spent a lot of time in industry and see, again, like still within the construction space, I think part of my goal is to understand where, if you were to take a look at any given project and the trends of the types of projects that are happening across America, where are the bottlenecks that I could add value ASAP? If we all have a part to play in the benefit of this organization and the benefit of this industry. And so for me, that's where I see my future.
What's a good way for folks to kind of get in touch or follow your work? We always, the follow-up question is going to be kind of how can the network help you? But ultimately it's, if they can't get in touch, that's kind of the first step. So what's a good way that folks can kind of continue to stay connected and see what you're up to?
Well, number one, professionally, LinkedIn. Feel free to hit me up on there, send me a DM. Similar to Twitter, it's my real name out there. So feel free to look me up and find me there. So LinkedIn or Twitter, those are the two best things. I guess it's X now, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Reach out to me on those platforms.
Awesome. And then what can the network do to sort of support what you're working on?
It's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. I think the big thing, I would flip it to them, is like, how could I help the network, right? I think now, having done this podcast, the listeners will have heard a little bit about my background. Again, if you get in contact, we can share more. But I think for me, I'm at a point where I just want to give back to folks. A lot of folks have taken a chance on me. Like, this is my opportunity to kind of pay it forward. And so the network could help me, I'm sure, in some way, but I'm trying to make sure I can help the network as well.
Oh my goodness, I'm desperate for a part two, but we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there for now. Victor, thank you so much. It's been an honor and privilege to have you on the podcast, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, guys. Really, really appreciate this.
Great discussion. Man, love that discussion. I always really like talking with and speaking with Victor. I've known Victor for a couple of years now, and I always find him to be kind of an insightful and genuine guy. And it was a great opportunity to actually spend a little bit of time with him. Learn about some of his things that he's excited about off the balance sheet. And it's really just a pleasure in connecting with good people, folks that are very thoughtful and intentional. And I think this episode just kind of captured Victor's spirit a little bit. And so I'm excited to see kind of where, his next leap takes him and sort of what he ends up doing professionally, whether it's in kind of the context of a large contractor or something in the entrepreneurial world. But in any case, I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of Victor soon. What'd you think of the conversation, Terrance?
Man, massive +1. Just such an insightful guy, somebody who will inspire you to want to do something more, right? He will inspire you to want to take the leap and inspire people who are less adaptable today, who want to get that level of adaptability that Victor has shown in his life and his career. I think is just going to be a treat for our audience. And I feel like I've known this guy for a couple of years now. You've actually known him for a few years, but his ability to connect with people and to tell his story around the things that he's accomplished and that he's done and that he's going to do next is pretty inspiring. So I'm looking forward to our audience listening to this episode.
Thanks for joining us on EIR Live. We hope today's episode offered you valuable insights into the entrepreneurial journey. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and check out the description for more details. Do you have questions or suggestions? Please reach out to us. Connect with us on social media. We really value your input. Catch us next time for more inspiring stories and strategies. Keep pushing boundaries and making your mark on the world. I'm Terrance with my co-host Ilya Tabakh, signing off. Let's keep building.